my name is Beck and welcome to a video where I talk about fantasy that I think is overhyped. I read a lot of fantasy, it's my primary genre, and there are a lot of titles that I see recurring and I go, I gave them about 3 stars, or I gave them 1 star, or I completely put the book down and I didn't like it at all, and I wanted to go over them today. So you may notice a theme with this video, and if you do, and you think of books outside of this theme that you think I would like, let me know down in the comments. I'd be interested to hear. I would like to start with Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. This is a book that I read during the Tome Topple readathon a few years ago now, and I enjoyed it at the time. I know it follows a character, I've forgotten all of their names and everything now, but it follows this guy who witnesses something tragic, and then based on that he goes to a soldier's school and he trains to become a soldier or a warrior. And I thought, awesome, this is going to be a magical school, it's going to have amazing characters that I can get on board with, it's going to have this trope of found family in it at the core. And when I read this book, it just felt very dry in terms of the pace. So because it took so long to get to particular milestones in the story, it lost me along the way, and I didn't care about the main character because it was more plot focused and lore focused, like world building wise, than it was directly character driven. And I'm not sure if this is the author's debut or if it's one of their earlier works, but I'd be interested in revisiting this author later once he's written more stuff, but I'm not interested in this series anymore. For me, it was just overhyped, the characters weren't that interesting, and it just lost my interest. So I wish I could like it because it seems to be like a booktube darling. A lot of people talk about it and get hyped up about it. And for plot readers, I think they would really enjoy it. For world building people, I love world building, but I need a character in order to get invested. I think you'd like it. I didn't know. And then next we've got another similar one, and that is Malice by John Gwynne. And this is a book that's first in a quartet, and in this world there are gods and giants. Actually, I'm not sure about gods, but I think there are giants, and it's about a war or a looming war based on historical events that are now becoming recurring between humans and giants. And it's a multiple perspective fantasy, whereas Rage of Dragons was just one character. So for Malice, I thought, okay, there's going to be a few different voices that I can try out and see if I'm going to like. I ended up also giving it a 3 stars because it was just middle of the road for me. It was enjoyable enough, but I didn't care enough to pick up the next book in the series. I wasn't invested enough. And again, this had all of those core tropes in fantasy that I love, like the animal companion, the chosen one, the quest. There was a lot going on, but I just didn't care because it felt dry and boring because, again, the pace. I couldn't get invested in characters and I didn't care for the pace. It lost me, like Rage of Dragons, along the way. That's kind of the common theme in this video, where books feel a lot more classical to me, like old hat kind of fantasy that is more journey focused and more goal focused on the plot rather than getting into your own characters' heads. And I'm not necessarily saying that these books didn't go and develop their characters, because they did, but they just did it in a way that I couldn't get connected to personally. So I put Malice down and then I unhauled the rest of that series because clearly it just wasn't for me. And if I'm going to invest my time in a book that is 600 pages long, I want to at least give it a 4 stars, and Malice was not a 4 stars. And then many people watching this video, if you've been on my channel before, might predict what I'm going to say next, and that is Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. This is a beloved fantasy series with so many fans, and I think that is incredible because fantasy obviously has so many people who are avidly into it, whereas in real life I walk around and I go, oh hey, I read science fiction and fantasy, and people look at me like I've grown a second head because I don't really read fiction or memoirs. So awesome of the fan base to be that big for a fantasy series, but it was again a series that focused to me a lot on the journey and a lot on multiple perspectives and world building rather than developing your characters. And there was a lot of miscommunication to me in the second book. And if I want my pace to go quickly and if I want development of characters, I want to latch on to people and then have them be active in the plot. I found a lot of things were happening to the characters, not because they did things, at least not directly. I'm probably going to be corrected because I've only read the first 2 books in the Wheel of Time. The first one was a 4 stars and that was really enjoyable. I loved the multiple perspectives. I loved them going on a quest. It was very early on of starting to like get the embers of these characters and build them up. And it had, again, all those core tropes in there of, you know, going on the quest, having the found family aspect, having the small town characters going into the big world. I loved all of that, and obviously I enjoyed the first book enough to read the second. The second one just let me down, and it was Again, just full of miscommunication. It felt like you could cut 400 pages out of the middle of that book and then it would still actually tell you a decent story. So if the rest of the books are going to be like that, and I've heard there's a slog that is 3 or so books long in the middle of the series, book 2 already felt like a slog to me, and that was not considered a slog book. So I'm not going to read the rest. Onto a more modern series is Jade City by Fonda Lee, and this is again another series that had multiple perspectives, and the characters were from a kind of gang origin-based family. So in this world, Jade is the core of their society. Obviously Jade City, you would make that assumption, but Jade gives the characters supernatural kind of abilities, but if it's used in excess and you're not trained properly, then it's like having a drug and doing an overdose. So I like the different ramifications of the magic in this world, how it actually has a physical effect on you if you don't use it right. That was awesome, and I loved the world building. I was actually equally invested in the characters as well. It was just the pace of this let me down. It dragged out so long. It was just not getting to the point. It was clearly setting a lot of stuff up that you'd probably see actioned in the second, third, and fourth book. Or maybe the second and third. I think it's a trilogy, but I didn't care. There was an emotional moment, or a moment that was supposed to be emotional in this book, and I'm not going to say when, but that moment just made me go, oh, okay, that happened, rather than being impactful. And that's when I knew that I would not be continuing, because if there's a moment that big and it doesn't make me any kinds of reeling or emotional, it's not worth reading. And so I put that series down as well. And I also gave this one a 3 stars. Another one is The Witcher. And because I think this is translated, it also lends to the fact that the pace takes a long time, even though the books are quite small. The writing style too feels like it is a play that is talking to me and performing to the reader rather than actually happening. And I don't know how to convey that in a clearer format, but it just doesn't really feel like I can get super duper invested, even though I want to, because there are characters in here that I love. I'm quite interested in what is going to happen to them and with them, but I just gave, I think this one a 3 stars, maybe a 4. There have been a few 3 and 4 stars in here, and also a 2 stars in this series. I think all of the hype for this is not well placed when I approach it. It's kind of like the Wheel of Time. Everyone raves about the Wheel of Time, and it's become the hype, kind of. This has become the hype because of the TV show. Everyone's like, The Witcher, yeah, Geralt. And Geralt is interesting, but I find him much more interesting in the show when you can actually see his expressions and stuff. If he's in the book, he does talk more, I'll give him that. He talks a lot more in the book, but he just doesn't get the airtime to do that, and he's not fleshed out enough in spaces in the chapters to do that. It feels like it's trying to do too much with too little pages. Coupled with a translation and the fact that the pace feels very slow to me, it's just a bit alienating. So I don't think this is worth the hype either. Now this next one might be a surprise given that Brandon Sanderson is an author that I reach for quite a lot, and the book in his catalogue that I want to talk about here is Elantris, and this is one of his first books. I think actually this was his first published novel, and this is a fantasy story with the city of Elantris set in it, and it's also a multiple perspective story, so it's got a few moving parts, but ultimately the overview is that there is this disease and it just randomly hits people, and one day you might be fine and the next day you wake up and you're like a zombie and you get thrown into Elantris and the doors are shut behind you to isolate you from the entire city. It's not really a contagious disease, it's just a disease that just hits you randomly, kind of like a random ailment, and that happens to the prince of this city just before his princess is supposed to arrive to meet on an arranged marriage. And so there's different avenues to get invested in because there are different characters, and quite like the other books in the Wheel of Time, because I know Brandon Sanderson finished the Wheel of Time, but I've not read his installments in the series. I imagine that the pacing was quite similar because Elantris, while it felt like there was actually a lot happening, which was a nice change, it still felt slow to me. And I could see the clunkiness of Brandon Sanderson's writing and the way he would set things up come to fruition in Elantris. Whereas if I'm reading a Stormlight book, for example, like Way of Kings, he sets up all of his plots and stuff in the same kind of chunks. Not exactly the same as Elantris, but you can see it a lot more clearly in Elantris, whereas you can tell how he's grown as a writer in Stormlight because it's a lot more seamless and you see a lot less coming. So when it comes to Elantris, I would say probably read Mistborn, like The Final Empire first, or The Way of Kings first, because that's what I started with. But if you're going to pick up Elantris, just be prepared to see the foundations of the story a little bit easier or closer to the surface than you might usually expect for Sanderson. So this one is a bit overhyped to me because I don't really understand it, because it's one of his earlier works, so naturally it can't be as good as what he's brought out recently. So I gave it about a 3 or 3.5 stars. I'd probably lower it to a 3. So it was just middle of the road for me. It's not one of my favorite Sandersons, but I'm glad that I read it. And now we have 4 more left. The next one is Waking Fire by Anthony Ryan. And I loved Bloodsong by Anthony Ryan, but I didn't read the rest of his books for a similar reason that I didn't read the rest of the Waking Fire series after I read the first book. I gave Waking Fire 3 stars, I gave Bloodsong a 4 stars, and the reason that I stopped reading both of these series is because, again, with the plot and the pacing, it didn't pique my interest as strongly as I was hoping for, but also with his different perspectives, I really struggled to differentiate the voice and tone of each character. He set them in physical different locations so that it was easier for you to gravitate towards who was talking as a reader, but it still just felt very samey to me. And the Bloodsong, the first book, it just focused on Valen, the main character. So when it came to voice and tone and experience, it was just all through his perspective. So that's why I really took to that narration. But when it came to the rest of the books in that series and in the Waking Fire series, multiple perspectives. So I didn't care again, and the characters weren't as deep as I wanted them to be. Maybe it's something to do with the tense that they're written in, but I wasn't observing that at the time. I do like third person and I also like first person, but I think third person relative is when you get some of their thoughts and feelings in the work as well as feeling kind of removed. So maybe it was just written in a third person that I wasn't connecting with, but I didn't observe that at the time. So Anthony Ryan is just an author that I've had up and downs with, which is why I'd like to try something new by him, but at the same time, I don't want it to be connected to all of his older stuff. I want it to be completely brand new, which is like John Gwynne. I want to try him again, but with something completely brand new. And that's why I've got Shadow of the Gods on the shelf behind me, because I'd like to try his newer work, but I don't really care for his older stuff. So even though I don't find the hype worth it for these books, I'm still going to try newer stuff by them, because as writers, especially distinguished by Brandon Sanderson in this video, you grow as a writer, your skills adapt and get honed. So while Elantris was only a 3 stars for me, Stormlight is a 5 stars, and I've reread those books and they're some of my favorites. So these authors can be turned around for me, just the hype for these particular books is not where it's at. This one might be a surprising one given that most people like this book for the characters, but I want to talk about The Lies of Lockemora by Scott Lynch. This is a story that is supposed to set up the bastard sons or these bastard kids who are orphaned and have to survive and pull long cons and stuff in order to get money. And so I thought, this is going to have that found family trope. It's going to have that rags to riches trope. There's going to be interesting characters and stuff. But when it came to the plot, it set things up with flashbacks. And I was like, well, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. So it spoiled its own ending for me. And not only did it do that, at the beginning of the book, something drastic happens that what's set up initially is not actually what's set up for the rest of the story, very loosely to be very vague. And because of those different facets of how the story was built, it alienated me from caring about the characters because I felt cut off from them. So I wanted to love this, and maybe I missed stuff because I was listening to the audiobook, but I've listened to a lot of fantasy on audiobook and I haven't missed stuff with that. So maybe I'm just being too nice, but I don't think The Lies of Lockemora is for me. Maybe I should try it again and see, but it's not something that I'm going to prioritize. So Lockemora is good, it's fine, but it's not my jam, and I didn't continue. Again, just a 3 stars. A lot of these I thought would be, shooting to the moon 5 stars, new amazing reads, and they're probably about 3 stars each. So in terms of rating, they're actually fine. They just don't match the hype and they're not 5 stars. And then the last book on this list is Captive Prince by C.S. Pacat. And this is a story that I read and really wanted to like, but because of the way that the world was, there was a lot of sexual violence in here. And I get that that's how the world was supposed to be. But there's a line, and for me, that book crossed the line. Whereas for others, it was probably an amazing book. But for me, line in the sand, didn't like it. So that's okay. Characters, subpar. I didn't really care for them. And as far as the pace was concerned, not too bad. The plot was a little bit thin in my opinion, but again, I haven't read it for a few years, so that might also be down to my memory. I don't actually remember all of the facets of reading it, whereas if I'd read it fresh last week, I could probably go, no, actually the plot is pretty good. At the moment, present me, didn't love it. 3 stars, didn't continue. It's not a super long fantasy series either. I didn't care about the characters, I didn't like the violence, and I didn't like the way that the world was set up and these characters were set up to be lovers. It is an enemies to lovers story, but the way that things were eventuating, it didn't seem like there could be any place of trust. But again, maybe it's a dark romance and I'm not into dark romances, so it's not my wheelhouse regardless. I'm surprised I didn't give it a 2 stars, to be honest. I must have given it a 3, but as far as overhyped fantasy goes, I think that is pretty much most of the overhyped fantasy that I want to talk about. If you've got an overhyped fantasy, let me know in the comments. You'll probably break my heart a little, but we've all got different reading tastes, so I look forward to hearing from you. But that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll come and chat to you in the comments, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.